My name is Harry, and I'm a professional 3D artist with over a decade of experience. I've worked most recently as a studio director of an award-winning architectural visualization studio. The images you're seeing on screen now are examples of my professional work. In this complete beginner tutorial series, I'll be showing you how to make this stylized magic portal from scratch. This tutorial series might be a little bit different than you're used to here on YouTube. I'll be approaching this entire project from a complete beginner's perspective. That means I won't be skipping any steps or going too fast for you to keep up with me. This process will help ensure people brand new to Blender will be able to follow along and understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. This beginner-focused approach will result in a tutorial that is slightly longer than you might be used to, but will be significantly more thorough and easy to understand if you're a complete beginner to Blender or 3D art in general. In this class, you can expect to learn the Blender interface and its tools. We'll learn about the many basic tools and interface elements within Blender while creating our magic portal. We'll learn modeling. While creating our portal, we'll use basic modeling tools and modifiers such as bevel and subdivision. Next up is lighting. We'll set up a simple but dynamic lighting scheme to give our portal a more magical look. Then we'll move on to shading. I'll show you how to make colorful and stylized materials that will give our magic portal a cartoon aesthetic. Up next is animation. I'll walk you through animating a magical swirl effect and floating stones surrounding your portal. We'll also make sure our animation loops seamlessly so you can convert it into a seamless GIF if you'd like to. Lastly, rendering. We'll render our final image in Blender so you can share it with your friends and family on social media. When we're done, you'll have all the skills you need to create a looping portal animation of your very own. Feel free to share your portal renders by linking to them in the comments below. I'll personally review every project shared and give you feedback on your render. If you find yourself enjoying this tutorial series, please consider checking out my premium classes on Skillshare. I've been making Blender tutorials as my full-time job for over a year now, and I'm excited that I can offer everyone a completely free month of premium Skillshare membership by using the link in the description and comments below. I currently have 9 unique classes focused on many different aspects of Blender. I even have the honor of receiving a staff pick for my Vaporwave animation class. In my classes, you can expect to learn topics like simple character modeling, animation basics, dynamic lighting, stylized textures, hair systems, and more. Don't forget to use the free offer link in the description and comments below to watch my classes as well as thousands of others across a wide variety of topics. With that out of the way, let's start the tutorial. Now let's open Blender for the first time. Upon opening it, you'll see something called the splash screen. In this case, the splash screen will show you the version number you're currently working on, some artwork that's associated with this version number, as well as a few different general file types, the open button, a recover button here in case your file crashes, and then also any recent file that you might have opened in the past. In our case, we're going to choose the general file type. So let's click this now. The general file type will start our scene with a few basic items in it, namely this cube in the middle, a camera over here to the left side, as well as a light over here on the right side. The first thing we'll be doing is preparing the render settings for our project. This will ensure that as we work on our project and get further into the process, everything is displaying as it should be. First, we'll make sure our cycles render devices are enabled correctly. To do this, we're going to go up to Edit, and then Preferences. Now on the left side here, go down to System. Now that we're on the System tab, we can go up here to the top and we can see our cycles render devices. So essentially what this is doing is it's telling Blender which pieces of hardware on your computer are allowed to be utilized while using the cycles renderer. So the cycles renderer is just a render engine, so we'll be changing that here eventually. Right now it says Eevee, but we will be switching this to cycles. And when this is set to cycles, it has the option to use a few different pieces of hardware. So we're just telling Blender which pieces of hardware are we allowing it to use. So in my case, I have 2 different options. I have my GPU, which is listed at the top, and my CPU, which is listed at the bottom. I have both of them checked, which means Blender now has access to both of them. You'll see different options here, assuming that your computer isn't the exact same configuration as mine. So this shows my specific GPU and my specific CPU. Regardless of what these say, make sure you have both of them checked. This is just allowing Blender to use both of them during the rendering process, which will speed it up. You also want to make sure that you're using optics if you have the option to do so. Optics is one of the more recent additions, and it's essentially just a sort of like a software that tells Blender how to use these pieces of hardware. So since it's the newest one, it's going to be the most efficient and it will speed up your render times a bit. If you don't have optics, that's completely fine. You should have the ability to use CUDA. So if you can't use optics, just switch it to CUDA and that's fine as well. Alternatively, if you're doing this tutorial on a Mac computer, you're going to have the option potentially for metal. So if you see metal up here, you can use that as well. So for now, I'm going to set mine back to optics because I have the option to do so, and I have both of these options checked here as well. With that done, we can now close this window. With that done, we can now go over here to the right side. We're going to go to the Render Properties tab, which looks like the back side of like a digital camera. So we can click this, and then we're going to be changing some of these settings here. So as I mentioned, we're going to be changing our render engine from Eevee to Cycles. Now that we have it switched to Cycles, we'll see a whole bunch of different settings down here as well. So to start with, let's go up here to where it says Device, and we're going to switch it from CPU to GPU compute. This will allow the Cycles renderer to make use of our GPU, which will significantly increase the speed of our render. Now let's go down this list. We're going to change the max samples on the viewport from 1024 down to just 100. So this essentially just changes the quality of the viewport render, which we'll see eventually later on in the tutorial series. But it makes it a lot lower quality, but it also makes it much, much faster. We don't need really high quality when we're just testing things. 1024 is kind of way overkill, so we're just going to set this to 100. We're also going to go down here to where it says denoise. We're going to twirl this open, and then we're going to check this little box here. Now for your denoiser, we're going to switch this from automatic and switch it to optics if you have the option to. So we're going to switch it to optics. If not, just leave it on automatic, that's fine. Optics is just a little bit faster when it comes to denoising, so it makes testing things a little bit quicker as well. Now going further down the list, we'll see here we have our render settings. So before we were just changing the viewport settings. So this had nothing to do with what the actual final output of the animation will eventually be. The settings down here for the render do actually affect the final output. So we're going to set these a little bit higher than the viewport because these are just meant for testing, whereas these are meant for our final image. So we're going to go to the max samples, and we're going to make this a little bit higher than the viewport, but still much lower than the default. So we're going to set this to 200. So it's twice as much as the viewport, but still, like I said, a lot lower than the really, really high default. And then go down to your denoise. Now by default, it's already checked on, which is good. We're going to twirl this open, and then just double check that your denoiser is set to open image denoise. In this case, we don't want to use optics. So optics is a lot faster, but it's also less high quality than the open image denoise. So for our final render, we still want the denoising, but we want it to be the highest quality denoising, not necessarily the fastest. So we're going to choose open image denoise. Now the last thing we need to do in this is going to go all the way down here to the bottom, and we're going to change the color management settings. So first we need to twirl it open so we can see the whole setting. And we're going to switch this from filmic, which is the default. We're going to switch it to standard instead. So you won't notice any changes here. Later on, maybe we can go back and I'll show you the difference between the two. But essentially all that you need to know is standard is going to give us a much more saturated and colorful look, a little bit higher contrast as well for our final render, which works out really well in our case because we're already doing something really stylized and colorful and high contrast. So we don't want the filmic setting, which filmic is really good for photorealistic renders. So if we're trying to make something look really realistic, if we were doing, say, an outdoor scene with trees and sunlight, and we were going for a realistic look, filmic is what we want to use. In our case, we're going for a more stylized, kind of cartoony look. So we're going to switch it to standard to make sure we're getting the most sort of bang for our buck when it comes to saturation and contrast. So we'll just have it set to standard for our view transform. And for our look, we can leave this set to none. We might play with this later on to increase the contrast of the overall image, but for now we can just leave it on none. Now the last settings we need to change are going to be on a different tab. We're going to go over here to the output properties, which kind of looks like a printer printing out a little photo. There's a few things we need to change here. So first we're going to go up here to the top, and we're going to switch this resolution. So right now it's set to a standard HD resolution, which is 1920 by 1080. We're going to switch this to make it a square. We're going to make it 1080 by 1080. So now we have the same resolution for the Y, but we've now made our camera, which we can actually see over here. Our camera now is displaying as a square format, which works really well for social media and things like that. And then the last thing we need to change is our frame rate. So again, by default here, it's set to 24 FPS, which is kind of like the sort of the film kind of Hollywood standard. However, it looks a little bit choppy for 3D animations, so we're going to switch ours to 30, which will just make it look a little bit more smooth. So we're going to set this to 30. And this is a pretty important setting, so make sure that you actually change the frame rate to 30, because when we get to the animation step, this is going to affect the timing of our animation as well. With these settings out of the way, let's talk about some of the important things you'll need to know about navigating around the Blender interface and the viewport. If you're familiar with the Blender interface and its keybinds and want to skip this brief introduction, you can go to the time listed here. The viewport is the name for this area that takes up the majority of our interface. This is where the bulk of our work will be done. It's essentially our view into this 3D world that we're creating. This shouldn't be confused with our camera though, as these are two different entities. The camera is where the image we create is viewed from, whereas the viewport is our view that allows us to affect the final image. You can sort of think of this as taking a picture in real life. You hold the camera in your hands and you might hold the camera up to your eye so you can get a better view of what you're taking a picture of, but your eyes and your camera can be at two different places at one time. You can set up a camera on a tripod and then move to the side and then take your picture with say a remote or something like that. So essentially the viewport is kind of like our eyes in the scene, and our camera is the camera, say on a tripod, maybe in real life. Throughout this tutorial series, you'll see all of my key presses and clicks down here at the bottom center of my viewport. So if I click the left mouse, you'll see here it lights up this little left gray box, letting you know I left clicked my mouse, or if I right click, it'll show the right click, and then this tiny little dot here in the middle, that's when I click in my middle mouse wheel. If you're ever confused as to which button I just pressed, just glance down here at the bottom and see what it was. As a quick disclaimer, I have changed some of my default keybinds to match my preferences and to make up for the lack of my keyboard not having a numpad on the right side. I'll call out these few situations as we go over them, but they aren't too common and shouldn't affect your experience at all. First, let's discuss how we look around in the viewport. So the first thing I'll show you is how to move around and rotate around inside your viewport. So this would be kind of equivalent from the camera and eyes analogy. This would be us kind of walking around our object that we're taking a photo of. So to do this, you're going to hold in your middle mouse wheel. We're just going to click in that button and hold it down. And then as you move your mouse back and forth, you will rotate around the object that's currently focused. In this case, our cube. Now, as I mentioned before, I did change some of my keybinds. So the key you're going to see down here is changed for my preferences. So don't follow what you see down here in this case. In this case, you're going to be using middle mouse wheel and just clicking it down and holding it. So when you click it down and hold it, we can rotate around and see around our cube. So we can actually kind of sort of like walk around this cube and see the back side of it. Now to pan our camera, so we're going to slide the camera left or right or up and down without actually rotating it at all, we're going to hold in Shift and middle mouse button at the same time. So we're just adding one more key. We're going to hold down Shift and then click in the middle mouse button, and that will instead just slide the camera left or right or up and down. And again, don't look down here. This is one that I have changed. So we're going to hold Shift and middle mouse button, and we can just slide it back and forth or up and down. So that's panning our view. Now we can zoom in and out of our object here. So we're going to zoom closer by scrolling up on our mouse wheel, just scrolling it up. And if we scroll down, we'll zoom out. So in and out to get closer or further away. Now you'll notice it moves kind of choppy. It moves in like small increments here. And we can change that by holding down Control. So holding down our left Control button, it's just below your Shift key on the left side. If you hold that down and then click in your middle mouse button, now if you move this back and forth, you'll see it's much smoother. Now it's a totally different way to zoom in and out, but if you need to move a lot closer and you want to be a little bit more smooth with your movements, this would be the way to do it. So again, that's just holding down your left Control and then clicking in your mouse button and moving your mouse. And then the last viewport navigation thing I'll show you is if for some reason this object here, we were moving around and it kind of gets it off screen or something, or it's really far out and we don't want to have to manually zoom into it. If something gets way off center and you want to refocus your view on it, if you go to your numpad on the right side and you hit the period key on your numpad, it will zoom you into that object and focus it right in the center of your screen. Now, as I mentioned, I don't have a numpad on this keyboard, so I actually had to move my key. But again, you're going to be using the period key on your numpad. So when you hit that, whatever object you currently have selected, you'll zoom in right to it and it'll center it right on your screen, kind of be giving you back to a default view of that object. Now that we understand how to view our object, whatever object we currently have in our scene, let's go over how to actually adjust this object or edit it. So first, how do we just remove this object? So there's two ways to do it. You can either just hit the delete key on your keyboard. So we hit that, it just deletes the object. If we want to undo the last thing we just did, in this case deleting that object, we can hit Control and Z at the same time, and that will undo the last thing we did. Now if we did multiple things, we can keep hitting Control Z and it'll go back one step each time we did it. If we want to undo multiple things at once, we can just keep hitting Control Z each time, and it'll go back one step for each thing that we've done. The other way to delete an object is we can hit X on our keyboard, and this will bring up a little context menu. In this case, it just says delete. So we can just click delete, and that will also delete it. Some people find the X key a little bit more useful because they don't have to move their hand off of their mouse or their left hand off the left side of their keyboard. So it's just a little bit closer. It does almost always bring up your context menu here, and then you have another option you need to choose, in this case, delete. But in some cases, delete and X are going to do pretty much the exact same thing, especially once we're actually editing the model. So it's really just a matter of personal preference. So again, we can just hit Control Z to undo that delete, and the cube is back now. And then the last thing I want to show you is how to add a brand new object. So if we zoom out a little bit, we can hit Shift and A at the same time to bring up our add menu. So A for add. And then we can choose from a whole bunch of different objects here: curves, meshes, surfaces, text, all those things. The most common one you'll use in this case is mesh. So when we hover over this, we'll see a bunch of different options, and then we can choose a different type of mesh. So maybe we want to add a cylinder. So we'll just choose cylinder. And we can see now that the cylinder has popped up directly in the center of the world here, right in the middle. In this case, it's actually inside the cube. So now that we have these two objects overlapping, let's go over the tools that we have to manipulate these objects. So let's move this cylinder outside of the cube. There are three main tools that we'll be using, and they're over here listed on the left side. So we have our move tool. So we can click this and it'll bring up the move tool, and then it'll show this little kind of control thing here in the middle. It has three different colors on it. And this is called a gizmo. So anytime you see these kind of floating handles on top of something when it's used on a tool like this, these are all called gizmos. So we have our move tool, we have our rotate tool, and then we have our scale tool. So let's start with move. So the easiest way to use this move tool is to just grab one of these handles on the gizmo, and it will move it in that specific axis. So in this case, if I grab this green handle here and move it this way, it will move it on just the green axis. So if I grab it again and move it, you'll notice that I can't move it in the red or the blue direction because I grabbed just the green handle. And this is true of all three of these handles here. So if I grab the blue handle, I can't move it on the other axes. I can only move it in the blue direction. Over here at the top right, we'll see an explanation as to what these colors correspond to. So the blue direction is Z, which goes up and down. We have X, which moves left and right, which is the red direction. And then we have Y, which moves forward and backward, and that's the green direction. We also have these handles here in the middle. Between these straight arrows here, these little boxes, this will allow us to move on two of the directions that it's attached to. So in this case, this red box here corresponds to both the blue and the green direction. So if we grab this little red box, it'll allow us to move it on just these two directions, but we can't move it left and right on the red direction at all if we grab this. It only moves it on those two corresponding directions. And that works with both of these other two handles here. All these methods here I'm showing you are using the gizmo to move the object. There is, however, a faster way to do this. Now this is a bit of a matter of personal preference. As you get better at Blender, you'll probably want to start using these faster methods, but throughout most of this tutorial here, I'm going to be using these gizmos just because it makes it really obvious what I'm doing. However, the faster way to do this would be to hit G on your keyboard, so G for grab. That's sort of the best way to remember this. So if you just hit G, it'll start moving your object wherever you move your mouse, but you'll notice it's moving it kind of based on the direction that your screen is. The cylinder always kind of stays the same size on your screen regardless of where it moves, but you'll notice as I move it around, it actually is going below this grid. So this grid is kind of like the floor of the scene. This is kind of like the lowest level of the scene. Now we can go below the floor, and that'll be in the negatives here, but you'll see as it moves it around, it's actually going down in space. So that type of movement isn't super useful, especially when you want to move it in a specific direction, maybe just up. So if you wanted to move it just up and you wanted to use that faster method, you can hit G to start grabbing the object, and then you can hit the letter that corresponds to the different axes. So if you want to move it just up, you can hit Z, and that will bind it to the Z axis. Now this works essentially the exact same way that the gizmo was working when we grabbed the blue handle. It's just kind of a faster way to do it. It doesn't revolve around you grabbing the gizmo. You can also do this regardless of which tool you're on. So if I was originally rotating it and I had the rotate tool selected with that gizmo on, and I wanted to move it up quickly, I could just hit G and then Z and not have to switch off of my rotate tool back to my move tool instead. So if I move it up here, I can just click to confirm that change, and now it's moved there. This also works by hitting G and then X, and you can bind it to the X, or you can hit Y and bind it to the Y. Now that we understand the basics of how these tools work, let's quickly go through the other two that we'll be using. So we have the rotate tool here on the left. And the rotate tool works very similar to the move tool. It has a gizmo that we can use. So in this case, if we grab the red circle, it will rotate it just on the X direction. We can grab the Y, which is the the green rather. And then we have the Z, which is the blue. And we can rotate it that way. We also have this white ring. So this white ring, you'll notice regardless of where we move, it always kind of faces us. So if we look straight down, we can grab the white ring and it'll move it this way. Or we can go down here and rotate it this way. We also have the option to use the fast method, which is the R key. So R for rotate. This one makes a little bit more sense. So if we hit R, it'll just rotate it based on whatever direction that white circle was sort of facing us. So this works kind of like the move tool, but it's just whichever direction your camera is currently facing. We can also just hit R and then an axis, so Z, and then bind it specifically to that axis, regardless of which direction we're looking. And then lastly, we have scale. So we can go over here, click the scale tool. This gizmo looks pretty similar to the move tool. And depending on which handle we grab, we can scale it in a specific direction. So if I grab just the blue, it'll scale it just in the Z axis, so it kind of stretches it out vertically. If I grab the red, just left and right, and then forward and backward with the green. We can also grab this white ring that surrounds it and scale it up uniformly in all directions. And then we have these handles here, these little squares that move pretty similar to the way the move tool works, where it'll scale it just on these two axes. So whichever axis is kind of floating between, it'll scale it just in those axes. Again, just like the other tools, we can hit the quick button to start scaling this, which is S, which again makes more sense than the move tool does. So we'll hit S, and by default, as soon as you hit S, it just scales this uniformly. Now this is one that we use pretty often. I don't often use the scale tool with the gizmo, because scale is something you pretty frequently just need to scale something uniformly larger or smaller, and that's really easy just by hitting S on the keyboard, and it just starts scaling it. You can move it to where you want, and then click, and then that'll cement that scale we just did. We can also do the S and then maybe X to bind it to just the X axis. We'll be using many more tools as we create our magic portal. However, for those tools, I'll explain those as we come to them, rather than trying to upfront you with a bunch of information. Right now, I just wanted to give you this sort of solid foundation, understanding really basic manipulation of objects within Blender. Now let's begin the modeling of our portal. We're going to start with the actual portal itself, and then later on we'll be making this stone ring around it. I'm going to start by zooming out so that I can see both the cylinder that you may or may not have created to test, and then this cube as well. So I'm going to select the cylinder, and then I'm going to delete it, and then I will select the cube and delete it as well. We won't need either of those to start with. Let's start by making a brand new mesh. So we're going to hit Shift and A to bring up our Add menu. We'll go to Mesh, and then we're going to choose Circle. Now before we do anything to the circle, we want to go down here to the bottom left where it says Add Circle. We're going to click this little option box to twirl it open so we can see the settings for the circle. Because there's a few things we want to change here. Right now the default vertices are set to 32, and this essentially just says how round is this circle. The more points we have, the more round it is. The less points we have for the vertices here, the more kind of blocky, and as you go really low, it'll start turning into like an octagon, a pentagon, down all the way down to a triangle. So as we have less points, it just makes it more blocky. The first thing we want to change here is the radius though. So we want this to be a little bit larger. We're going to set ours to 1.5 meters. And by default, you don't have to type in meters as long as your scene is set to meters, which is the default. So we just type in 1.5. We can see here it says 1.5 meters now. And then the last thing we need to do is you'll notice that this is kind of just like an orange circle. It doesn't have anything inside it. It doesn't look gray like the other objects did. That's because it has no fill type. This is kind of a weird object in that it doesn't start with any faces. So we're going to need to tell it, have some surface to it, not just be this orange outline. So we're going to switch it from nothing. We're going to change it to triangle fan. So essentially what this is doing is just filling in this orange circle with a whole bunch of kind of like pie slices or pizza slices shaped like triangles, filling in the middle of this object. Now that we have our basic circle created, we can now rotate this on its side. So again, there's two ways we can do this. We could just go to our rotate tool by clicking on this symbol up here at the top left, and then we could rotate it on the X direction. So this is the red handle here. We can grab this red handle and then rotate it so that it's vertical. You can also hold down Control while you're rotating this, and you'll see it puts a whole bunch of little increments here, and that's going to rotate it, kind of snapping it to specific measurements. At the very top left, so my circle is going to go a little crazy here, but if I go up to the top left here, you can see what the actual rotation of this object is. So I'm going to undo that. And if I wanted to rotate it perfectly vertical, I would want the rotation to say 90 at the top. So I can rotate it there and then let go. And now I have a perfectly vertical circle. So that's kind of the slow way to do this. Now it's the most obvious way because it's using the gizmo, but there is a quicker way. So I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that rotation that I just did. And the quick way you can do this is, again, this doesn't require me being on the rotate tool. So I'm actually going to go to the move tool because that'll be more useful here in a second. You can hit R to start rotating, then hit X to bind it to just the X axis. And now we can actually just type in a number. So if I know I want it to be exactly 90, I can just type in 90 and then hit Enter, and it'll confirm that change. So you can do that with any rotation that you want. So if I wanted to rotate it 180 degrees, I could just hit R, X, 180, and then hit Enter, and it'll rotate it. I'm going to Control Z that because it was already how I wanted it. But that's the quick way you can rotate an object. So if you want it to be exactly 45 degrees in a specific axis, just hit R, the axis letter, and then type in the number you want. Now before we go too much further, let's rename this object. Right now it's just called circle because that's the type of mesh that it was. Now we want to make sure our file stays nice and tidy and we know exactly what things are. We don't want just a bunch of stuff up here named box and circle. We want to know exactly what that object actually is. So we're going to double click on the word circle up here. We're going to call this portal and then hit Enter. So now we know later on when we're looking through this list of objects, so this displays everything that's currently in our scene, we know that this specific object, if I select it, it's actually the portal. So right now our portal is a perfect circle, which isn't really the look that we're going for. I'd rather this be a little bit more oblong. So I want it to be kind of an oval, a tall oval. So let's start scaling it inward so that we can kind of make it a little bit thinner in the X and Y direction. So first I'm going to hit S to start scaling. And now I want to hit X to bind it just to the X direction. So this red direction here, and I'm going to scale it in just a little bit. So I make it kind of an oval shape. And don't worry about getting this perfect because we're actually going to type in a number here in a second. So we can just move it into there. So now it's a sort of a tall, skinny oval. And you'll notice down here, it's popped up this little option box. So the scale we did isn't set in stone until this option box disappears. So luckily, we can go down here to the X direction, which is what we scaled it on. And I'm going to type in 0.75 and then hit enter. And now it'll be exactly 0.75 scale in the X direction. So you can kind of scale it sort of roughly to where you want. And then if it doesn't look good or you want to match an exact number, just go down here and type it in. You could also just do S, X, and then 0.75 and then hit enter. Now, in this case, it's 0.75 smaller than the already 0.75, so that didn't work in this case. But if we started from a perfect circle, you could just do S, X, 0.75, and you would have resulted in the exact same scale. Now you'll notice we have this kind of light gray grid overlapping our object. It's kind of right in the middle of our scene here. Now we can turn that off. We really don't need to be seeing this grid. We will leave on these colored lines here as a kind of an easy guide to show you which direction you're moving things in terms of the axis, but the grid itself is just kind of overlapping our scene and making things a little harder to see than they need to be. So we can hide that grid by going up here to our overlays tab. We're going to click on this little drop down here to see all the different viewport overlays we currently have, and we're just going to uncheck floor. So you might think it's grid, but in the perspective viewport, which we'll get to what that means later, this is considered the floor. The grid is actually for the other views, say the orthographic views, and we'll leave that on either way. And again, I wouldn't disable these axes over here, so that's what hides these lines. If you really want to, you can have the Z axis turned on. By default, it's turned off, but we'll just leave these X and Y axes still turned on. Now that we have the base shape of the portal created, let's make it a little bit more interesting by adding a few modifiers. Modifiers are effects that we can apply to our models that do a vast array of different things. The two modifiers we'll be using for this portal will first smooth out the edges of the portal so we have more geometry to work with, and then we'll be deforming this smoother geometry to make the edges of our portal a little wavy. To add our modifiers, we're going to go down here to this little blue wrench icon. We're going to click that, and that'll switch us to our modifier panel. Make sure you also have your portal selected. You can see here, this is the modifier panel for the portal object. If I have a different object selected, either that tab will disappear or it will show different modifiers. So make sure you have your portal object selected just by left clicking on it here in the viewport. We can tell it's selected because of this little orange highlight here, as well as the fact that it's highlighted in blue in this list at the top. I'm going to zoom in to my portal here just so you can see what the effect of this first modifier is. So we'll notice here that the edges of this, we can actually see small little corners on this portal edge. And it's not very obvious from a distance. It looks pretty round, but as we get closer, we'll see that it's actually not that round. It has flat spots all along it. So let's add our first modifier now. We're going to do that by making sure we're in the modifier tab, going up to add modifier. And then we're going to go all the way down here on the second column, and we're going to choose subdivision surface. So once we click that, we'll notice right away the edge of our portal changes, and it's also a little bit smoother. This subdivision surface modifier is adding more geometry to our model and then averaging the distance between all of those different pieces of geometry and kind of smoothing out and rounding the object. And it's changed, the smoothness level is changed by the numbers that we have typed in here. So this is the smoothness that we're going to see inside our viewport. So levels, and then it says viewport here, it's cut off though. So the higher number we make this is only going to make it smoother just in the viewport. So this is kind of similar to our viewport versus render settings that we adjusted in the beginning. So this setting here is just for the testing, just for the viewport, and then this is what it will actually display when we final render our image. So if our viewport is higher than our render, then it's actually going to be smoother when we're testing than it is when we're going to be rendering. So in most cases, you want to have these either the exact same number. So in our case, we're going to set both of these to 3, which makes it much, much smoother. Or you would want your render set higher and then your viewport set lower, because you might not need to have it really smooth for your testing, but you do want it really smooth for the final image. But like I said, in our case, we're going to set both of these to 3. One important thing to consider about modifiers is that they're considered to be non-destructive. So what that means is essentially that anything we do in modifiers isn't permanent. We can always turn them off, we can get rid of the modifier, and the model will go back to how it used to be. So a way to see an example of this is you can actually hide the effect of any modifier in your viewport or on the render just by clicking one of these buttons here. So this one here that looks like a little computer monitor, when I turn this off, you can see my model goes back to being jagged, even though I still have the modifier applied. So if I turn this back on, I can see the effect of this modifier back in the viewport again. With the edges of our portal nice and smooth, now let's add another modifier that will make them wavy. We're going to go back here to where it says Add Modifier, and we're going to add a brand new modifier called Displace. So first we'll click this, and then we're going to go to the third column here, and we're going to choose Displace. You'll notice the portal moved when you applied this modifier, but that's just because we haven't added any textures to it yet. So let's zoom out so we can see the whole portal here. So this displacement modifier that we just added is going to be using a black and white image to determine how much it will move or displace certain parts of your model. We'll start by adding a texture to this modifier now. So first we're going to click this little new button here. This will add a new texture, in this case a blank texture, so it kind of just goes back to being a big circle again. And now we're going to click on this little button here. It kind of looks like two different sliders. We're going to click this button here, and this will allow us to adjust the texture that we have set in here. So we could import our own image if we'd like, or we can choose from a whole bunch of different defaults that they have here. We're going to start by using clouds for our texture. Now we can see right away that this changes a pretty significant thing about our portal. So it's jagged on the edges, and also it's jagged in the middle as well. Now, in this case, we're not actually going for this kind of crazy jagged look for everything. So we're going to be changing some settings to make this a lot more subtle. And also we want it to keep the portal flat. So we'll be fixing that later. So to start, let's change some of the settings down here for this clouds image. So we can see the image here. This is what it's actually using to displace this portal. We'll start by changing the noise basis. And this kind of just changes the type of noise it's using. It's like a different algorithm that it's using to generate this noise. So we're going to go to improved Perlin. This is just, you can see it just changes the type of noise. Now we can go down here to the bottom. We're going to change the size of this noise. We're going to make it a little bit bigger. So we're going to set it to 0.35. So the noise now is a little bit larger. We're going to set this depth to 0. So we can either click on it and type in 0, or you can just click on this. You'll notice that your mouse turns into a little left and right arrow. And that's because these are considered sliders as well. So we could slide it left and right to change the number. So you could just slide it all the way to the left and make it 0. And then this option down here, the nabla, we're also going to lower that down to 0. So we have 0 for both of these, and then 0.35 for the size here in the top. So now we have this cloud texture set up. Now let's get rid of the kind of lumpiness that we're seeing. We want it to only be affecting the edges of our portal. So to do that, we're going to go back to the modifier tab, because when we started adjusting this cloud texture, it actually switched us to the texture tab down here at the bottom. So click on this little blue wrench icon, and now we need to adjust the settings here. And the main thing we need to switch is actually the direction. So we're going to switch it from normal, we're going to set it to X. So that means that this is only going to be affecting the X direction. So it keeps it perfectly flat, and it only displaces it left and right. So now we have a wiggly edge here, this kind of wavy edge. It's also a little bit too strong though, because we're noticing it's actually kind of overlapping things in the middle. So let's adjust the strength. We're going to make it half as strong. So down here at the strength, we can just click on the number and then type in 0.5 to make it half strength. Now we'll notice the edges here are a lot more kind of subtle and just kind of generally wavy. We are getting a little bit of overlapping here in the middle, but that's really going to be completely unnoticeable for the most part later on. So we're not going to worry about fixing this. This is a really, really subtle thing. And once we have it fully textured and lit, you won't see this at all. And with all these modifiers applied, we now have a nice little portal made with wavy edges. Now, before we finish this episode, we need to make sure that we save this file. So we're going to go up here to File, and then we can choose Save or Save As. In this case, we could just do Save because we haven't saved this file at all. It's currently just an untitled file, but you can also just choose Save As. It's going to do basically the same thing. So we're going to choose Save As. And now that we've hit Save As, it's brought up an option box here that we can navigate to a location on our computer, ideally something that you're going to remember later. You don't want to lose this file. So I would save it to either a folder on your desktop or in your documents or on an external hard drive, somewhere that you know where it's at and you can come back to it later. So you navigate to that location using either your folders here on the left side, or you can just type in the location if you know the exact file path. And now we can give it a name. So I'm going to go down here to the bottom. And I'm just going to call this Magic Portal. And I'm also going to put an underscore and then 01 at the end of it. So this isn't mandatory, but it's something I like doing. So basically, if I make another version of this portal and I'm getting ready to do something that I may or may not like, if I'm completely changing the shape of it, I can just change the number at the end of this and I can save multiple versions of this portal. So by adding a number at the end of it, it just makes an easy way to make multiple versions of this. I could have Magic Portal 01, 02, 03, 04. And it just makes that whole process a bit easier. So I'm going to put an underscore 01 at the end of mine, and I would suggest you do as well. And once I have it named, I can just choose Save As. In the next episode of this series, we'll start modeling the stone ring that surrounds the portal. I'll see you there. Don't forget to click the link in the description and comments below for a free month of Skillshare. Watch my classes as well as thousands of others across a wide variety of topics. For the sake of transparency, I do receive a small amount of money if you decide to continue your subscription after that first free month. I truly appreciate the support. If you're enjoying the tutorial series so far, like the video, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you're notified when I release new content just like this.